Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 4 of Genesis chapter 34, and we will be reading from verse 1. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her, and lay with her, and defiled her. And his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. And Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out unto Jacob to commune with him. And the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved. And they were very wroth, because he had wrought folly in Israel, and lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. Okay, we'll stop reading there. In our last study, we started here in Genesis 34, and then saw that there was a related passage in Deuteronomy 22. That is related in the sense that there are several similar ideas. And in Deuteronomy 22, verses 13 through 21. And then also we went over to 2 Samuel chapter 13 and found another passage where there are the same ideas, and several of the same ideas. And that is where we're going to turn now. And in 2 Samuel 13, it's the account of David's son Amnon, who listened to the deceitful counsel of a man named Jonadab, who was a relative. He was the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, and he was said to be a very subtle man. And Jonadab's counsel was for Amnon because he was infatuated with his sister Tamar, who was a very beautiful woman. But we read that although he fell sick for his sister Tamar, lovesick, we've all heard that expression, he thought it hard for him to do anything to her. That is, maybe he was speechless. He just couldn't bring himself or to speak with her and to let her know how he felt. So Jonadab's counsel was to set up a situation where Amnon could be alone with her. And now I'm not sure how much Jonadab understood of Amnon's intention, but it was certainly deceitful what he told him to do. He told him to feign himself to be sick and then to speak to his father, the king, and ask the king to send Tamar to him to make him cakes and sort of to act as a nurse for a little bit. And David grants the request, and Tamar comes and begins to make him cakes. And as she does so, Amnon tells all of his servants to go out, and then he told Tamar to bring the cakes into his chamber, which would be his bedroom. And then we read in verse 11 of 2 Samuel 13, And when she had brought them unto him to eat, he took hold of her and said unto her, Come, lie with me, my sister. And she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee. Howbeit he would not hearken unto her, but being stronger than she, forced her, and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. We wonder, well, what changed him historically? What caused him to suddenly hate her so? And we can probably gather that he had built up in his mind, how wonderful and great something would be, something sinful, which is the tendency of man. Oh, if only I can have this particular desire, then it's all I want. And of course, sin is a lie. What it promises is a lie. It promises wonderful, great things and delivers misery. And so he was disappointed, as sin will always disappoint. Plus, she had pointed out to him, Do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. And she said further, Whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Therefore, after he had done what according to his lust, he felt foolish. He felt convicted. He felt the impact of her words, that he had done something that had been folly in Israel, and he hated her for it. He despised her for it and wanted her out of his sight. Just get this woman out and bolt the door. And so that's what happened historically. And it goes on to say in verse 15, Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. And she said unto him, There is no cause. This evil in sending me away is greater than the other that thou didst unto me. But he would not hearken unto her. Then he called his servant that ministered unto him, and said, Put now this woman out from me, and bolt the door after her. And she had a garment of divers colors upon her, for with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Then his servant brought her out, and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head, and rent her garment of divers colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went on crying. And Absalom her brother said unto her, Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. He is thy brother. Regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. And by the way, if you go through the whole chapter and look up how many times Tamar is mentioned, you will find she's mentioned 13 times. And of course, that is something we see often in the Bible in passages that identify with the time of the end and either God's judgment on the church, because that began in the year 1988, the 13,000th year of Earth's history, or the judgment on the world. So that's a clue for us that would help us to understand perhaps some of the spiritual meaning of what's going on here. This is a whole big study in itself, and we are not going to try and go through verse by verse in this account. Lord willing, later we will go back to Deuteronomy 22 and look at the spiritual meaning there, and maybe just come back to 2 Samuel 13 for some comments on what might be in view here. But for the most part, we just want to see the similarities and between Genesis 34, Deuteronomy 22, and 2 Samuel 13. And here's one thing we see, is that virgins are in view in each passage. Again, here in 2 Samuel 13, Tamar had a garment of divers colors upon her in verse 18. For with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. Her clothing, this garment of divers colors, was an indication she was a virgin. And after Amnon forces her, then in verse 19, Tamar put ashes on her head and rent her garment of divers colors. And so it's not surprising that her brother Absalom, who's her full brother, recognizes that she has been with someone, and he knows that she was called to go to Amnon. And as soon as she comes back from visiting her half-brother Amnon, she has ashes on her head, and her garment is rent. And she's laid her hand on her head and went on crying. Something terrible happened, and the renting of the garment that indicated her virginity was obvious. And so Absalom knew right away. She didn't have to answer him. She didn't have to, when he said, "Has Amnon been with you?" It was clear. And so here, Tamar is a virgin who loses her virginity, and that is consistent with Genesis 34 with Dinah. Although the word virgin is not used in that chapter, yet we can derive it. We can conclude that Dinah was a virgin due to her being forced and Jacob saying that she has been defiled, made unclean, that she had previously been a virgin, and she dwelt in the tents of Israel as they sojourned. So Jacob would have had close watch over her, and she also had all these brothers that, as we can see from the Genesis 34 account, were very watchful over her, and the idea of anyone defiling her infuriated them. So if there had been a servant of some kind, it would have not been possible really in the tents of Israel. But when she went out to this town, then Shechem saw her and took her and forced her and defiled her. And this would have been probably the first opportunity where she was away from the watchful eye of her family. And so everything points to Dinah being a virgin who had her virginity taken and also forced, as we saw here in 2 Samuel 13. But as far as a virgin, if we go back to Deuteronomy 22, in Deuteronomy 22, that's the whole question. In verse 13, if any man take a wife and go in unto her and hate her, and give occasions of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found her not a maid. And the rest of the passage indicates that to find her not a maid means she was not a virgin. And now there is a difference because the man has married her. He is married to this woman, and it's after marriage he finds she's not a maid. On one hand, that this is just the law God lays down, and there's also the possibility he's charging that, but she was a maid. But we'll, again, get back to that. So virgins are in view in all three accounts. In, again, Genesis 34, Dinah was forced. In 2 Samuel 13, verses 14 and 22, Tamar was forced and also shamed and humbled. The word translated defiled in Genesis 34:2 is also translated as humbled elsewhere. Well, and one thing consistent in all three passages is folly in Israel. In Genesis 34, the statement is made in verse 7, and the sons of Jacob came out of the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, and they were very wroth, because he had wrought folly in Israel, in lying with Jacob's daughter, which thing ought not to be done. And in Deuteronomy 22, we read in verse 21, then if the thing is true, if the tokens of virginity are not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die, because she has wrought folly in Israel to play the whore in her father's house. Folly in Israel. And also in 2 Samuel 13, let's go back there. 2 Samuel 13 and verse 12, and she answered him, Nay, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing ought to be done in Israel. Do not thou this folly. So with the use of this word, as well as being forced and virgin, see, God is directing us. He's saying, take a look over here, take a look over there, and that's what we're doing. Oh, and another thing is in Genesis 34, the very last verse of the chapter, when Jacob, in the context of Jacob saying to Simeon and Levi that they've troubled him because now the people of the land will come against him and destroy him. And they respond in the last verse, verse 31, and they said, should he deal with our sister as with a harlot? That's the same word that's in Deuteronomy 22 that we just read in verse 21. At the end of that verse, after she has wrought folly in Israel to play the whore in her father's house. And that is translated as harlot in Genesis 34:31. It's not found in 2 Samuel 13, but it is found in these two other passages. And now the idea of being hated, which is not found in Genesis 34. Actually, we read that Shechem loved her in verse 3, and his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. And that is different than 2 Samuel 13, verse 15. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. Now he did love her at first, but then it turned to hatred. And of course, it wasn't real love. It was a worldly kind of love. The people of the world, they talk much of love, and they have no real understanding of it. And that's why their love may, they can love someone for 3 months or 3 years or 30 years, and all of a sudden they stop loving them. Well, that's not true love. But anyway, that's beside the point. So Amnon hates Tamar after first loving her. In Deuteronomy 22, we find in verse 13, if any man take a wife and go in unto her and hate her. And then the father says in verse 16, and the damsel's father shall say unto the elders, I gave my daughter unto this man to wife, and he hateth her. Now again, since he married her to begin with, it would seem to imply there was an initial love. You typically wouldn't marry unless you had a love, but the love turns to hatred here as well. So this is similar to 2 Samuel 13, but we do not find Shechem hating Dinah in any way. There is hatred, I suppose we could say, as the sons of Israel come upon the city and slay them, and kill the male inhabitants of the city. Well, yeah, they hated them in that sense, but it's different. There is this difference. Another thing that's in view is marriage. In Genesis 34:4, we read, "And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife." He, Shechem, wants to marry Dinah. In Deuteronomy 22, the man is married, but concerning his marriage, he is bringing occasions of speech against his wife, saying she's not a maid, not a virgin, in order to end the marriage. And so if it were true, if she had committed this fornication, then she would be killed, and the marriage would end in that way. There would not be divorce. On the other hand, if what he's saying is not true, then the law says or stipulates he must remain married to her for the rest of his life. He could not separate from her for any reason. Whereas in 2 Samuel 13, it is Tamar who makes reference to marriage in verse 13, "And I, whither shall I cause my shame to go? And as for thee, thou shalt be as one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, speak unto the king, for he will not withhold me from thee." And that can only mean marriage. The king would give her to her brother in marriage. And the final similarity, well, there may be more, but these are the 7 that I've noticed, is death. Death. In Genesis 34, Levi and Simeon come upon Shechem. We read in Genesis 34, verses 25 and 26, "And it came to pass on the 3rd day, when they were sore, the 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out." So there is much death in view in Genesis 34. In 2 Samuel 13, going back there, we find that Absalom patiently plotted to kill his brother. And we read in 2 Samuel 13, verse 28, "Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, Mark ye now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say unto you, Smite Amnon, then kill him, fear not. Have not I commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. And the servants of Absalom did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and every man gat him up upon his mule, and fled. Amnon is slain like Shechem is slain. Shechem forced Dinah, he's killed. Amnon forced Tamar, he's killed." And in Deuteronomy 22, it is the woman who is killed. If what the husband says is true in verse 20 and 21, "But if this thing be true, and the tokens of virginity be not found for the damsel, then they shall bring out the damsel to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die, because she has wrought folly in Israel to play the whore in her father's house." That is the consistent theme right there. Shechem is said to have wrought folly in Israel. He is killed. Tamar said to Amnon, "Do not thou this folly, no such folly should be done in Israel." He is killed. And the woman who has engaged in fornication prior to marriage, she is killed, and the reason is because she has wrought folly in Israel to play the whore. So we can see these 3 things. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. At this point, Lord willing, we'll get together in our next Bible study and pick this up once more.
Thank you for joining us for eBible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.